new to you that geopolitical tensions remain strong and the understanding of the world remains complex. So I'm going to introduce to you the four first participants who've accepted to take up the challenge of this first roundtable, namely up to how far will power rivalries go? Agatha, Kratz, partner, Rhodium Group. Good afternoon, please, if you will have a seat there. Andrew Bishop, Senior Partner, Managing Director of Political Research at Signum Global Advisors. Tania Sollogoub, Head of Coordination for Emerging Countries and Geopolitical Risk Analysis at Credit Agricole Group. And Thomas Gomart, Director at IFRI, French Institute on International Relations. Désolé. Thank you. The topic is very complex. We could be talking about it for several days. Thomas, we saw you in the introduction video. I'd like us to come back to that. Last year you said that everything would be fine. So what is the event that in 2025 has affected you the most? Well, yes, everything's going to be fine. That's why we're here this year to talk about it, and we'd like to confirm last year's conclusion. Now, to be more serious now, the event that struck me the most this year is probably the one in the Oval Office with the humiliation on President Zelensky by the American president and his vice president, because this happened after two key events, namely the investiture speech by President Trump with the drill baby drill, and also another moment after that, namely the awareness raising of the Chinese technological advance. And in this Oval Bureau, this Oval Office, I saw something that would be very announcing, something very brutal in its form, but also in its in the content of it. And as for the form, no need to discuss this further because it's we all know what happened. But when it comes to the content, this has announced a kind of an ideological convergence between the White House and the Kremlin as for Ukraine, and this is a major change, actually. Tania, same question for you. What struck you the most in terms of event last year? Hello, everyone. In seeing your video, I thought that I should have changed event because the most striking thing is our capacity to forget things as it goes. Really, this is what I mean, you know. This is a question I have in the mind. But this being said, I believe that what struck me is a rather invisible event, namely the swift in the change in the way that we analyze the United States object, so to speak. This is a swift. This is something different because there's something very brutal, a political crisis. Trump is only a character in this situation, and this compels us, whatever our respective positions, to try and put a name on this risk. And whatever happens, you know, it's about reflecting about the subject on diversification. This is one first thing. And second, I think that as for all those things that happened last year have eroded the legitimacy of the United States or even the Western world to in terms of being prescribers in terms of standards, especially human rights standards. And this is quite an operational problem. And I think that this situation is going to deploy. Andrew, what struck you over the last 12 months? I would say the custom duties announced on the 2nd of April, and they were announced on the 2nd of April and not on the 1st of April on purpose, in such a way that there's no confusion. Because on the 1st of April, you know, we could have thought that this would have been a joke. And actually, the reason why these custom duties are something striking for me is that because in this situation, there are three different levels of reading, of understanding. First, the fact that he's always impressive in going always further in going off the grid more and more, increasingly, because we expected him to announce something massive, and in the end he announced 50% on some countries, and we were surprised. Another level of understanding taking place on the 9th of April, the fact that Trump is is chickening out, so to speak. And third, the fact that Trump manages to think that he is TACO, T-A-C-O. Actually, it's 10 steps ahead and 1 step behind in terms of customs duties, American customs duties. So, this way of doing things, this modus operandi is very impressive. Agatha, what about you? I'm telling you from my Chinese little window, because I'm an economist specialized on China, but many things happened over 2025, especially in the Chinese and American relations. But I think that there are 2 specific days, 4th of April and 9th of October, 2 days when China has published controls on exports with a scope which is unprecedented on the 4th of April, and above all, especially on the 9th of October. And I think that now we're switching to a higher level as for a maximalist usage by China of its hand over this critical value chain. And this is important for 3 reasons. First, because this is rebalancing the power equation between China and the United States, especially in the short term, in the mid-term, until the moment when the United States will manage to become independent from China. And another thing, which is a good news for companies, it reduces the scope of power for China, for the United States and the Europe vis-à-vis China. Because, things are going to be increasing vis-à-vis Beijing, towards Beijing when it comes to Beijing in the next few years. And also, because of this situation, we're becoming more protectionist. This is what is taking place in Europe with the local content and so on and so forth, And without naming China, the allies, the partners are, it's at the expense of our allies, of our partners. And these result in huge consequences. We mentioned the United States with different rules of the game. So, Thomas, what is the Monroe Doctrine, which is actually a very personal understanding of the Monroe Doctrine by Trump? Do you think that the Americans are imperialists, isolationists, or both, maybe? As for the debate on, the United States imperialism is, it's indeed a topical issue, but I think that above all they have this capacity according to which they used to be able to define rules, but now they do that in a very brutal manner. Now, there's a paradox related to the Monroe Doctrine. It's a reference to Monroe Doctrine. The change, Don is like Don Corleone. It's an indicator of a Trumpist sense of humor, so to speak. But this shows that there's a logic of the fact that protection needs to be paid for. I think that this is the key message which is sent out brutally to Europe. But now it's not only from the United States, it's a word in a very direct manner. But the paradox is that this hemispheric vision is that the United States are retracting, so to speak. Make America Great Again may be for Trump's United States in acceptation global situation with this notion of hemisphere, sphere of influence shared by China, with China and Russia. This is very well worded because actually from Cap Horn to Greenland, this will be a very specific area for the United States. Same for Russia, as they are presented by Putin, a part of Eastern Europe is part of their zone of influence. But I think that there's a paradox. This centrality, which remains very strong, specifically for Europe, when it comes to finance, when it comes to technology. And I think that this paradox is translated also into the fact that the United States want to remain the guarantee of this situation, but also to remain remain the number one, even if it doesn't mean that the common good doesn't need to be maintained as it was in the past. Andrew, what about your view? Do you have the feeling that there's an American vision of things today? Indeed, there's a vision which is specific to Trump's administration, but it's not the same as Trump's. So there are two ways of seeing things. Trump's viewing of things is like a legacy, in other words, legacy is trying to write his own book of history where, he will be remembered as being the key leader, the main leader, the great leader, and so on and so forth. And this is why at Trump there is no consistency, no coherence in terms of whether he's isolationist or whether half of his mandate of his presidency will be in Iran or whatever, He does what he thinks is the best for his legacy, but he may be misled, he may be wrong. So he may be aggressive, for instance, Venezuela, Iran, Greenland, so on. But on the at other times he will be peaceful, more pacific. For instance, Ukraine, like having a peace agreement between X and Y. This is not the same vision as Trump's administration. It's more coherent. It's a dual. On the one hand, isolationist, total removal, total withdrawal, and second, creation of a bloc of allies with Europe against China. This is more striking than what Trump envisages. Agatha, you mentioned the Asian country, among which China in the first place. What can be the consequences on relations between China and the American, and also the relations between China and other blocs, such as Latin American countries? First, I agree with Andrew's vision of the Dunroad Doctrine and also the Trump administration as a true strategy related to China that Trump doesn't have. And last year I heard that Trump is a dove among hogs. This is true, because his policy related to China is based on transaction with a deal making. But when it comes to Trump's administration, and we can see that in the security strategy, in the American approach about the Western Hemisphere, China is not really there. But there are three components related to China in this Dunroad Doctrine. First, the will to get rid in the Americas of any external influence, including the Chinese influence. It can be economic, diplomatic, political influences. But this is becoming very tangible, very specific when it's about critical infrastructures. We can see how the United States rather is attacking, so to speak, is tackling the Panama port. But also Central America, South America, there are going to be the similar actions. So it's very escalatory, very aggressive. It's really part of the Dunroad Doctrine. Second, the will to recreate critical value chains in the Americas, rather than in China or in the ASEAN countries. And as we said in the introduction, there was a shift of the value chains towards Southeast Asia during the first Trump's administration, with the first custom duties with China. And this doesn't match the Dunroad Doctrine. So the pharma, the chips, and so on. So all this must be in the Americas, in the Dominican Republic or Panama or whatever, rather than in Southeast Asia. And this is very important when it comes to the global trade, and also it's a will from the United States to have a hand over resources, and whether it is at the expense of China or against China, namely to retrieve resources from Chile, from Peru, in order to supersede the Chinese value chains. And this is paramount, and this is my last word about it when it comes to the Chinese and American relations. Because we are in a truce that's been dating back to the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump in Busan. But there are very aggressive actions in the Western hemispheres that may disrupt this agreement. As for resources, what do you think, Tania? Do you have the feeling that from Trump, from his administration, that there's a true resource geopolicy?
Yes, and I actually concur with everything that's been said so far. I just would like to add something and follow up on this to talk about long-term reflection on the merits of what we've said. And this obsession of resources, my impression is that we have not gauged enough the existential nature for the US of such issue. First, we need to remember that there's never been any hegemonic cycle that is not backed by any key resources, coal or anything. And here we're talking about metals. And we have to keep this in mind because it's not only a matter of depending on something, but rather on one's very existence, because this actually can affect their hegemony. Something else that is quite important, it's not only dealing with the US when we talk about the metal cycles, but rather the fear of shortages. And that predates Trump, because before Biden had carried out a survey on value chain shortages, and they were afraid of shortages for 50 critical essential metals. And the mental crisis is not the same as it was during a more open globalization era, despite the wonderful video clip of Coface we've just seen. Well, you can laugh if you wish, but because you talked about open globalization. Anyway, this fear of shortages, why? Well, that's because that's the cornerstone of the social pact. And this has been awakened during the COVID crisis. You remember the problem of mustard in France? But joke aside, this is where something will weigh down on public policies. We get into the matter of security. Shortages, it's very important, not only for the US, but last point, it's a matter of alliances forged for products. And something else that is very important is awakening this matter of national security. It's not happening just during the Trump era. Sorry, I'm going to talk about Hannah Arendt during the 70s, but she said that the Watergate case was already a matter of national security, the Manhattan Plan as well. And when we talk about national security, well, this is when we can see governance drifting away. And it's very important because we get into a logic of permanent exceptions. And with Trump, these are the key issues that will structure public policies, not only in the US, actually. Gomart, you were talking earlier about the brutality of the US policy, of Trump's policy. Are you worried when it comes to democracy? Is it naive to think that after Trump's departure in 3 years or 7 years, if the Constitution is wiped away, everything will be back to normal? Well, when we do our job, it's not the question to ask ourselves. We have to be lucid, and we have to try to pinpoint any tendency to change pathways. And this is what I saw in the US. I was talking about ideological convergence with Kremlin. But we're not in the same situation at all. We have a civil society in the US, as was reminded earlier, that was mobilized. There are checks and balances. There's a separation of powers. We're struck at once by the swiftness of transformation that took place in the US under Trump administration, but we've had a Trump 1. Let's not forget that. We haven't analyzed that yet well enough, the ins and outs of this Trump 1 administration. And there were practical changes since then. There's also the capacity for the US to adjust themselves. We all think about the midterms in November, and then afterwards there will be the elections in 2028. If I follow my line of thought when it comes to change of trajectories, and it's very hard to think about it because we have to think about the Democrat Party. There are some decisions as made by Trump. I'm talking about WTO, where the Democrat Party doesn't want to go back on. So first, we have to anticipate the way in which the American system will self-regulate itself and adjust itself, and we shouldn't think about things in the lines of thought of a comeback to the happy globalization era as it was taking place back in the day. So there's still a separation of powers in the US, and that can be adjusted, that can be changed. Is there self-censorship in the US when, for example, when it comes to economic stakeholders? I don't know if censorship is the right word. I'm dealing with think tanks and research centers, and we have to be cautious because there are a lot of pressures that are exerted, and we have to be very careful as to the type of words uttered there. When we were talking about Russia, we have to be very careful when we deal with geopolitical risks, because we've talked about the trajectories that were analyzed, and this is a subject that we can also use when we have to screen through China, because when you're dealing with China and Taiwan, you know that you're going to have some very strong reactions from your Chinese partners. Rather than self-censorship, I think that when we talk about geopolitical risk, well, when we're dealing with companies, you have to meet with public authorities, and this is a term that we have to use. We have to navigate through these hurdles. And I think they're dealing quite well. We're saying Coface, not the Coface. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. That's part of the world developments. Tania, how will markets perceive geopolicy from a wider, a broader overview? It's hard to tackle this in 5 minutes. There's the European Central Bank that has published a very interesting publication on the subject. I have a table that I will sum up for you. There's what we can see, there's what we cannot see, and the rest. And that's not the same. First, in 3-4 years, for 10-15 years, I've been working on this, but there's a huge metamorphosis of the risks. Things that are perceived and seen today. First, markets have understood that geopolitical issues are not external criteria. They're part and parcel of the problem. We have to adjust. We have to plan ahead. And this is what is being done today. However, I could see that there's, a tendency to mainstream everything. That's because of our tools, our economic tools, because the way we operate with cycles. We need new tools. And also, we can actually perceive the fragmentation of the world, but not all its components, namely the legal components. And what the market perceives is the components of the geopolitical risk. What I found was very interesting was what you said earlier. You were talking about everything related to trade, to military forces. This is something that we didn't take into consideration before. But there's something else today. We have to make a distinction between the event from noise, when it's much ado about nothing, when it's actually something that is endogenous, and sometimes we have an event that is mitigated. Sometimes we just think that we make a lot of noise about nothing, like the pressure in Taiwan. Well, when we talk about the pricing in Taiwan, nothing was priced then. And secondly, with Trump, often we get into something that is actually the show society. You know, we had that in the 70s, like telenovelas. I have investors saying, what is the next episode? What is coming up next? And since we had forgotten what we had before, it's hard to apprehend the risks. And what about possibilities, because we are in a kind of a dystopia. So when we talk about Greenland, what are we pricing now? And I'm summing up, sorry, but what is happening right now as we speak? In my opinion, the market is saying, okay, no, it's not the geopolitical event that needs to be priced. Panama wasn't priced at all, actually. But what we need to get is trying to get dotting the lines. And what impacts finance growth, global transmission channels, energy transition. So risk department works on transmission channels and how to connect the dots. And I will wrap up with the US, because we have a problem. And I wouldn't like to be a rating agency now, to tell you the truth, because we have to rate what is exceptional. The dollar risk, we have to talk about it. But also what we have to say about the American risk, that it is a bit off from the political risk with regards to the institutional issue, because there are battles. It's not institutionalized. And so the political risk is no longer a stable environment in the US. And this has a cost in terms of rating. That's the perception of markets. Thomas, how would companies perceive this geopolitical situation? Is there an awareness raising or not? We'll talk about company managers later on, but how about a global overview? Yes, there was some awareness. Some tools have been incorporated by organizations. I could make a very wide answer because it depends on sectors, because some are more affected by the geopolitical risks than others. But we do not have the same assessment of the risk, whether if we are in Northern America, in the Asian countries, in Europe. So for each issue, we have to look into the details. There is this taking into account of the risk, but organizations need to back off from the geopolitical issue to try to be geopolitical neutral in a way. So they have to do everything to make sure that business goes on no matter what. And we have to see which points are important. Like the bombing of Qatar by Israel is a very interesting point for Qatar, for instance, because there's a lot of money gathered in a small jurisdiction, and we have to be aware that the safety can be threatened by Israel, and that actually entails support from the US to Qatar, and also Israeli forces consequences. And we have to take into account the ripple effect, as was said earlier, when geopolitical issues can have an impact on war. This is how we'll sum up the situation. If it does not boil down to this, this is where we stand. I would like to follow up on this, because the problem is a matter of threshold, because we're getting accustomed to everything. And after some time, anticipations will move, because we'll pinpoint a critical triggering event that will destabilize the world stability. We have to be aware of this, because we're going from a logic which is very binary, talking about geopolitical risks, to something that is, well, let's accept uncertainties, we'll have to change our methods, and we'll have to make scenarios. And we have to go from forecasting to forward-looking. And this is how we try to quantify our weaknesses based on scenarios. And this is the way it goes. When we talk about rivalries, we haven't talked about Russia yet. Thomas, this is a subject that you know well. Should we anticipate an important commitment from Europe? And what about defense? For what defense? For which country? Well, as you said, it's a major commitment because it comes from the official doctrine, namely the strategic national defense policy as drafted by the French president in last July. In item 7 says explicitly that all assumptions outside the national territory is a very highly there's a high likelihood of necessity to defend oneself. And this is very much embedded in the preparation plan. That's not to say that it will happen, but the armed forces of European countries of NATO are in this path and in this course of action, and companies are quite disconnected from this perspective. So we have to reconcile both, or wonder, and ask ourselves the question, what does it mean for companies? 2030 is tomorrow, you know? And the second item is that this war in Ukraine has made Europe lose its main asset, its main cutting-edge asset, which is the benchmark element. So we can have forecasts for 2026 of a possible ceasefire. The negotiations are ongoing, as you know, between Ukrainians and Russians with American mediations. We don't know if it's mediation or pressure exerted on Ukraine. That's another open debate. But bearing in mind what we could observe from Ukraine, a ceasefire would not enable us to go back to the situation as it was before the Ukrainian war, but rather to a lasting situation between Russia and the European countries. Do you feel that it's still a priority for the US to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? I think yes, because it's extremely important for Trump, the President Trump, but it's not on the original schedule that he had in mind. Well, what is quite interesting, it was not. With Coface, we didn't think that it would be, so it's not a surprise. But very soon he actually showed up as a fool when he talked about 24 hours, but he had no intention to end up the war in 24 hours. He stated that, but before taking the power, he understood that it would take him much more time. And a lot of stakeholders and actors thought that if he didn't manage in 8 months, in 9 months, he would just give up. And we've seen that this was wrong because this is part of his legacy. And if it happens before 2029, then it is important for him. We would think that he would give up after the Oval Office scene that was quite surrealistic that Thomas mentioned earlier. What do you think about Europe? Do you think that it is completely landlocked in its own polarization? I would like to this is a question that was actually prepped. It was prepped ahead of time because the Polish give me a lot of good arguments when they block a lot of important cases on the matter of debt and borrowing. But what I would like to put on the limelight when we talk about polarization of politics, we talk about Europe, but they are Europes. It's difficult to talk about singular. Because when we talk about public policy arbitrage, because during this roundtable, I think we should talk about political crisis. And in its first meaning, there's the geopolitical crisis. The political crisis of the average class, of the middle class, carries on in Europe. And it will affect significantly, because we talked about the arms race coming up again. This will have an impact on Mercosur, on public policies. I don't know how it will weigh down the agricultural policy and the relationship with Ukraine in the EU, but we have to keep this in mind. This is what I wanted to remind you all. Agatha, you've said it. Your cup of tea is China and Asia. Should we revisit the relationship? Should Europe revisit its relationship with China, bearing in mind what's happening with the US? Well, if it were not the case, we would not see Starmer and Carney and Merz also, who will be the German Chancellor who's going to go there. We have a long waiting line to go to Beijing to try to speak with Xi Jinping, and it seems to be a minimum service, so to say. But the French position also seems to be, seems to follow up on this, and today there's less opportunity as compared to the risks, and China has not a lot to offer in the current context. The Chinese economy is sluggish. We said that it grew by 2.5% and not 5%, and next year it will be 1.5 to 2% and not 5%. Of course, the Chinese figures will say otherwise, but when we make the calculations on the same baseline, we reach different results. So the Chinese economy is rather down. When we talk about $3 trillion economy, of course, it's quite interesting to have some growth, even if somewhat underwhelming. But when we deal with the European countries, export to China is also looking backwards, because exports to China was 0% in terms of growth. For an economy that grows by 2.5, it's not a lot of opportunities for you. When we look at different sectors, German automotive industry, they grew by less than 44% if we compare year on year. So the export opportunities are not very developed. Of course, there are opportunities, but it's more and more restricted, and the space in the room given to China is actually dwindling. We have a lot of competition. We have a deflation trend coming up. And also, they say that margins are higher out of China than with China. So in terms of profit generation, it's we make more profit with other countries than China. This year, we have an excess of trade from China, which is the highest ever. And these are records coming up year after year. We've made a calculation last year, and we found out that 25% of industrial employment was threatened by Chinese exports. So we are in a situation of risk which is very high. And the Chinese policy, when it comes to overcapacity, we're dealing with denial, because there's no credibility from the actions of the government to say otherwise. The list is long, so I'm going to stop here, but I think there are more risks than opportunities. The last point I would like to say, relating to President Macron visiting China, well, the only silver lining that we still have on the agenda for the European is the one that I just mentioned, but it's still weak with a deflationist environment in China and excess production in China. So there's no reason for a Chinese company to invest in Europe or in France. If not, in a situation where the tariffs would be much higher. So I think that the opportunities are quite limited. Because of the Chinese competition, should we have a rapprochement?
So this is the question. I would give you the same answer, but in less good, because I absolutely agree with Agatha. Namely, the only thing I would add is that China is not only an economic threat for Europe, but also it's the country thanks to which Russia is keeping fighting in Ukraine. So the only scenario in which we would envisage a Russian military victory, is a scenario according to which China would decide Russia to win. So China is indeed an economic and physical threat for Europe, and not to mention the cultural threat. You know, it's up to each of us to see, to consider that. So what about the degradation of transatlantic relations? Well, actually, here some will see an opportunity in the fact that Europe is in a sandwich between the two entities, and others would see it as a risk. And I clearly see it as a risk personally. I would like to add on the fact that there's no clear opportunity vis-à-vis China doesn't mean that the relations shouldn't be stabilized. In my introduction, I said that the striking moment of the year is the usage of China and the hand from China over the critical minerals, and therefore China can put a stop to a big part of our manufacturing production. And therefore, we need to have a relation with China that is stable, and therefore this means that travels, diplomatic visits, and travels that are a way to ensure that this stability is going on. Andrew. Well, this is the difference between China and the United States as rivals to Europe. In other words, Europe has decided not to be against the United States. It could have done so. That was the case. It was nearly the case with Greenland. Thomas, are there subjects on which we could discuss further about China, especially when it comes to climate? Well, it's also about aging population, because indeed these are issues that are in common between China and Europe. And when it comes to climate, indeed, I think we shouldn't put it aside, because indeed China is a country which has a dual approach, namely to have a very carbonized mix, but also to have the most constant investment in terms of low carbon technology. And by the way, it's also about the control of the value chains, pertaining value chain, sorry. And from the time when we consider that the challenges related to mitigation or adaptation to global warming must remain a priority, which is actually the position of Europe, and this determines a number of public policies, but also the directions taken by companies. There's a dialogue actually with China, which is now ongoing. It's continuing. But the question is, how will this be going on with the United States, in making this distinction in the different organizations, for instance, the federal organizations that are very critical when it comes to this agenda and related to climate. So therefore, this topic compels the Europeans to keep a level of discussion with China. And when it comes to the manufacturing power of China, there's also the technological power of China. And we've understood that it is the global technological power, and we are understanding that in a number of segments, China is now ahead of us. And this is, on this also, we must be realistic in this balance of power, which is now not in the favor to the Europeans, who for a long time thought that they were ahead on the others from a technological point of view. And I will bounce back on what Andrew said. There's also a positioning of China in its support to Russia in Ukraine, and this is now a question, an issue which is related to European security itself. Closer ties with China or changes in relations with China? So Thomas, Thomas said something, he said a word which is very important, namely realism. Actually, we're entering into something which is real geopolitics. And this is something which is very common. It's becoming, developing everywhere in Europe. In other words, actually, it's the big victory of real geopolitics. A state has no friends, only interests. This means that there's a problem in terms of alignment between the different states, and in reference again to the fragmentation, in the relations with China. There's another issue: the alignment of companies with their own state. And what I'm saying actually is that there's the coming up of a new risk for us in terms of businesses, namely the risk of a disalignment with our own states. Therefore, we will need clearer instructions. Yes, we'll discuss this later with the chair of Renault. He says that there may be alliances with countries with which we're not used to have alliances. Indeed. Another thing now. I was listening to this topic related to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and I was thinking, well, if I may say so, well, journalists will quote what I'm saying in asking my authorization, tongue-in-cheek. But actually, when it comes to the German growth, luckily enough, we are having this war. We are having this conflict, because otherwise our situation wouldn't be that optimal if we didn't have this speech related to disarmament. This is just a comment I'm making on the way, so to speak. But actually, the question for the companies is, where shall I go and get this some growth? because indeed, there's all these difficulties related to manage things, but also this is when it comes to the direct matters. But when it comes to the indirect matters, when I see the position of China in ASEAN through the RCOP and in the deepening of the value chain on a number of projects, well, what I can say is that if we want to go and seek for growth, it's again about the ASEAN. We will be in indirect relation with China. That's why it's so complex to manage. The strategic positioning that we will be having. China is a player that is unavoidable, but in different manners: direct, indirect, geopolitical, macroeconomic. Now, we have very little time now. As a conclusion, what about the overall reorganization of the powers? I know, Thomas, you have this subject at the bottom of your heart. So what about the reorganization of things, the recomposition of things? Power, what is power, actually? It's the capacity to mobilize resources and to give them a direction. And that's the word that we try to add to Europe, the fact that Europe needs to have political power, economic power. If I try to outline the existing organization, well, between China and the United States, that there are two dual twin economies that are in rivalries of displayed power with some specificity, namely the nuclear effort produced by China nowadays in such a way that it can be in a parity, in an equal level with the United States and Russia. The two countries that were previously mentioned are of 85% of their position in the world. And I think this is the first thing. And second, there are transactional logics. We can describe things in the following thing. There's the ambition by a number of countries to have a powerful behavior. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Israel, and so on. So it's how far is this will of power facing the security matters. This is also related to partnerships and alliances. That's the first level. Another and more major level, as mentioned Carnet in his speech in Davos, the average powers. In other words, the big majority of countries wish to remain in an open world, in an openness, but there are minimum rules. There are minimum number of rules to remain in this openness environment. And this is the political message from Europe. It probably involves not only the fact that one needs to be powerful, but also or to behave with power, which is the case of China and the United States. Tania, we don't have much time now. What really counts for the long-term investors now in this context? Well, I would like to bounce back on what was said, because it's paramount to me. Behind this geopolitics of conflict, there's a reorganization of the flows, of the routes. There's a word that's come up, which is key, namely corridor. India is looking for its corridors. This means that there's a conflictual aspect about the seas, but there's the construction of new corridors, a lot of infrastructure on the lands. This goes with the resources. For instance, in Africa, there are works everywhere there are projects, there are works that are taking place for instance, in the Indian Ocean. But this is going to have an impact on the global geopolitics. And these corridors are not under the hands of China. It's also about what's taking place between Saudi Arabia and Brazil when it comes to food, between India and the Emirates, because these countries, south-south, based. They're standing for 40% of global trade. And these countries are in the capacity, for some of them, they're in the capacity to keep in mind this One Health approach, which is key, namely climate, health, human health, animal health. They develop a long-term strategy, they do planning, and I'm an economist of country risk, and I'm very surprised to see that on many countries, Vietnam, Morocco, this reflection in the long-term accumulating geopolitics economy, because they're in the capacity to be part of geo-economy. And they all seek for their pattern, for their model of, is it going to be a hub? Are they going to be unavoidable because they have such or such raw material? But maybe I'm a bit optimistic, but there's something taking place there as for the public policy of these countries of the Big South. Thank you. I'll suggest that we stop here so we remain on time. But thank you, big thanks really to all of you for taking part to this first round table. Well, so Agatha Kratz, partner Rhodium Group, Andrew Bishop, senior partner and managing director of political research at Signum Global Advisors, Tania Sollogoub, head of coordinator for emerging countries and geopolitical risk analysis at Crédit Agricole Group, and Thomas Gomart, director of the IFRI. Thank you.